There are some things a man carries to his grave, and there are some things that come to his door before he gets there. In the town of Calder's Fork, high in the dry bones of the Arizona hills, the old folks still don't agree on which of those the panther was. But every one of them agrees on this. Nobody who saw it that November ever slept quite the same again. I was 31 years old the winter it happened, and I thought I understood the shape of the world. I thought loyalty was a thing that lived only in people, and only in the good ones at that. I thought an animal was an animal, hunger with a heartbeat, nothing more. I had a notebook then, a little water-stained thing I kept in my coat, where I wrote down the temperature and the price of feed, and whatever else a ranch hand thinks is worth remembering. By the end of that month I had stopped writing prices. I had started writing something I still can't name. If you have ever loved someone so completely that the loving outlived every reason for it, then maybe you'll believe what I'm about to tell you. And if you haven't, if you're still waiting for that kind of love to find you, then stay with me anyway. Because the strangest, gentlest, most unbearable thing I ever watched walk across a dying man's floor was not a person at all. It came on 4 silent feet, out of the dark, and it had come to say goodbye. The knock that started it wasn't a knock at all. It was a scratch. Low on the door, patient. The way a thing scratches when it isn't trying to break in but only to be let in, there's a difference, and your body knows it before your mind does. I heard it from the kitchen where I was boiling water that Sila's wren, God love him, was too far gone to drink. It was the 9th of November, and the wind was coming off the ridge cold enough to make the tin roof tick. And I stood there with the kettle in my hand, and my heart doing something foolish in my chest, because there is no good reason for anything to be scratching at the door of a dying man's cabin at that hour. I should tell you who Sila's was, or you won't understand the rest. He was 84 that winter, and he had been a cowboy in the last true days of it, when the work was still done from the back of a horse, and a man's word was the only paperwork anybody signed. He had come to Calder's Fork as a boy of 9, orphaned off a wagon that lost both his parents to the fever between Texas and here, and the town had raised him the way towns used to raise a boy nobody owned, a little by everyone, badly and well in equal measure. He'd broken horses. He'd buried 2 wives. He'd never had a child that lived past the cradle, and he'd stopped speaking of that particular grief so long ago that most people had forgotten he carried it. What he had instead in his last years was me, a hired hand who'd stayed on long after there was money to pay me, and a dog named Boone who'd died the spring before, and a memory of a cat that I did not yet know about and would not have believed if you'd told me. Sila's was dying of the thing that takes most old men in the end, everything at once slowly. His heart, his lungs, the machinery of a body that had done 90 years of work in 84. The doctor came from Prescott twice and then stopped coming, not out of cruelty but out of honesty, because there was nothing in his black bag for what Sila's had. So it was just the 2 of us in that cabin and the wind and now that scratch. I set the kettle down. I picked up the rifle by the door because a man in that country would be a fool not to, and I want you to know that I was not brave. My hands were not steady. I have thought 1,000 times since about what would have happened if I had fired through that door the way half the men I knew would have. I didn't. Something stopped me. Call it luck. Call it the hand of whatever watches over fools and dying men. I only know that when I cracked the door open into the cold and the moonlight, I did not shoot. There on the packed dirt of the porch, sitting as calm as a house cat on a windowsill, was a black panther. I have to be careful how I say this because you're going to think you know what a thing like that looks like and you don't. She was not the size of the mountain lions we shot for the bounty. She was bigger and blacker, black the way the space between stars is black, a black that seemed to eat the moonlight rather than reflect it, so that her outline was less a shape than an absence, a hole cut in the night in the shape of a great cat. Only her eyes gave her away. They caught the lamp behind me and threw it back gold, and they were fixed not on me, not on the rifle, but past me. Into the cabin, toward the bed in the corner where Sila's lay breathing his slow, wet, terrible breaths. I froze, Every animal instinct I owned told me to slam the door, and every one of them was wrong, and somehow I knew it, because the panther did not crouch. She did not flatten her ears or bare her teeth or do any of the thousand things that come before a killing. She simply looked at me, and I swear to you, on the grave I helped dig not 2 weeks later, that there was a question in that look, a patience, as if she had walked a very long way and was only asking whether she had come to the right door. "Wick," the voice came from the bed, thin as paper. "Wick, who's there?" "My name is Wick, Thomas Wick, though nobody has called me Thomas since my mother died." I did not turn around. I could not take my eyes off the cat. "Nobody, Silas," I said, and it came out cracked. "Go back to sleep. It's just an animal on the porch." And then the old man said the thing that changed the whole shape of that night, and every night after. "Is she black?" I want you to sit with that a moment, the way I had to. A dying man who could not lift his own head off the pillow, who had not left that bed in 9 days, asking me, before I had said one word about color, whether the animal at his door was black. "Yes," I said, the word barely made it out. "Yes, Silas, she's black." For a long moment there was nothing but the wind and the tick of the roof and the wet machinery of his breathing. And then Silas Wren, 84 years old and 3 days from his own grave, began to laugh. It was the smallest, driest sound, more like a cough than a laugh, but I had not heard him make it in months, and something in my chest broke loose to hear it now. "Well," he said, "let her in, Wick. God Almighty, don't leave her standing in the cold. She hates the cold." I did not let her in. Not at first. You have to understand I was a reasonable man, or I thought I was, and reasonable men do not open the door of a house to 140 pounds of black cat on the say-so of somebody whose mind might be going soft at the end. I stood in that doorway with the rifle useless in my hands, and I looked at the panther, and the panther looked at the bed, and behind me Silas kept saying, gentler now, almost pleading, "Let her in, son. Let her in. It's all right, it's Sombra, it's only Sombra." Sombra, Spanish for shadow. He said it like a name he'd worn smooth with saying. The cat's ears turned toward the sound of it, toward the name, and she made a noise then that I have never heard any wild thing make before or since, not a growl, not a hiss, but a low, chesty rumble, almost a purr, except that it carried in it something that sounded for all the world like grief. And she stood, and she took one step toward the door, and she stopped, and she looked at me, waiting, asking. A creature that could have opened my throat before I finished, a scream, was standing on a dying man's porch, asking a frightened ranch hand for permission. I stepped back. God help me, I stepped back and I opened the door. She came in the way water comes in, no sound, no hurry, filling the space she moved through. She was so much larger inside the little cabin under the low ceiling that the room seemed to shrink around her. She smelled of cold and pine and something older, something mineral, the smell of caves and high places. She did not look at me again. She crossed the floor to the bed, and she rose up not to pounce, but to set her great front paws on the quilt, gentle as a mother testing a sleeping child. And she lowered her enormous head, and she pressed her face against the hollow of the old man's throat. And Silas Wren, who had not had the strength to hold a cup of water in 2 days, lifted both his trembling hands and buried them in the black fur of her neck, and he wept. He wept the way I have only heard a man weep 2 or 3 times in my life, the kind of weeping that isn't sadness exactly, but something too big to have a single name, a whole life coming out through the eyes at once. "You came back," he kept saying into her fur over and over. "You came back, you old devil, you came back." I set the rifle down against the wall. My legs would not quite hold me. So I sat down hard in the chair by the stove, and I watched a wild panther and a dying cowboy hold each other in a lamplit room, and I understood that I was seeing something I had no right to see, and no way to ever explain. It was a long time before Silas could speak to me. The cat lay along the length of him now, half on the bed and half off it, her great head resting on his chest, so that it rose and fell with his ruined breathing, and her eyes were closed, and the terrible tension had gone out of the old man's face for the first time in weeks. When he finally spoke, His voice was steadier than it had any business being. "You'll want to know," he said, not opening his eyes. "I can see it eating you alive over there. Go on, ask." How was all I could manage. How does she know you? And so, in the small hours of that cold November night, with the shadow cat breathing on his chest, Silas Wren told me the story that Calder's Fork would tell for the next 100 years. Though none of them would tell it right, because none of them were there, and I have never told it to a living soul until now. It began, he said, 40 years before, on the worst day of his life. He'd been a younger man then, though not young, in his 40s, hard and quick and certain of himself in the way men are before life has finished with them. His second wife, Ada, had died that spring of a burst appendix, 3 days of agony that no doctor could reach in time, and Silas had come apart in a way that a man of his generation was not permitted to come apart in the open. So he'd done what such men did. He'd taken a horse and a bedroll and a bottle, and he'd ridden up into the high country to either come back a man again or not come back at all, and he told me plainly, 40 years later, that he had not much cared which. It was up there, in a box canyon 3 days' ride from any human soul, that he found her. She was a cub then, half-starved, one back leg mangled in the steel jaws of a trap, the kind of trap men set for wolves and forgot about. Her mother was nowhere, dead most likely or driven off. The cub could not have been more than a few months old, and she was dying the slow, ugly death of a small thing caught in a machine, and when Silas came on her, she did the only thing she had left to do. She hissed. She spat. She dragged her broken body around to face him, and she showed him her tiny, useless teeth, and she prepared, with everything she had, to die fighting. And I looked at her, Silas told me, and I thought, there's the only honest thing I've seen in a month. Everything's dying, and she's the only one with the guts to spit at it. He should have shot her. It would have been the mercy, and he knew it. Instead, he built a fire, and he sat down just out of reach of those little claws, and he waited. All that first night he waited, and all the next day, talking to her low and steady the way you gentle a spooked horse, and every time he moved she screamed at him, and he did not stop. He soaked strips of jerky in water and pushed them toward her on the flat of a stick. It took 2 days before her hunger beat her fear. It took 2 more before she let him near the trap, and when he finally closed his hands on the cold steel and pried those jaws apart, she sank her teeth into the meat of his forearm to the bone. He showed me the scar, 4 white pits gone silver with age, and he let her. He let her bite down, and he pried the trap open anyway, and he freed her leg, and then he sat back and bled into the dirt and said, "There. Now we're even. You hurt me and I hurt you, and neither of us meant it. That's most of what love is, girl, if you live long enough to learn it." He didn't keep her. That's the part the town never understood in all the versions they'd invent later. He didn't cage her or chain her or try to make her into a pet. He mended her leg as best he could with a splint of green wood and strips of his own shirt, and he fed her until she could hunt again, and then one morning he woke and she was gone. He thought that was the end of it. He rode home a little less broken than he'd left, and he went back to the long business of living, and he did not expect to ever see the black cub again. She came back that winter, and the next, and every winter after for 40 years. Never in summer, Silas said. Summer she's got her own life up high, and I got no place in it and don't want one. But when the cold comes down off the ridge, that first hard cold, the one that means the years turning to bone, she comes down out of the dark and she sits on that porch and she waits for me to open the door. And I let her in, and she sleeps by the stove a night or 2, and then she's gone again till the next year. 40 years, Wick. 2 wives, 1 dog, a whole town full of people I've buried. And that cat has come to my door every single winter of my life since the day I opened a trap she'd have died in. Now you tell me, and here his voice finally broke, you tell me what that is, if it isn't the truest friend a sorry old man ever had. I had no answer for him. I have none now. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the stove and I watched them, the man and the shadow, and toward dawn I did take out my notebook after all, and I did not write the temperature or the price of feed. I wrote down the word Sombra, and I wrote down the year 1889, which was the year Silas said he'd found her. And I did the arithmetic 3 times because I could not make it work, and it would not work. And I want to be honest with you here at the end of this first part, because everything I am telling you turns on it. A panther does not live 40 years. 12 in the wild. 15 if it's lucky and fed. 20 is a miracle nobody's ever recorded. 40 is impossible. 40 is a thing that does not happen, cannot happen, in a body made of blood and time the way ours are. I told myself she was a daughter, a granddaughter, that the first cat had passed the door down to her young the way a trade gets passed, mother to cub, the porch and the man and the winter ritual of it. That made sense. That was a thing a reasonable man could hold. And I believed it for a while, until the panther on the bed opened her gold eyes in the gray light of that dawn and looked at me across the room, looked at me the way a person looks at you, the way something looks that is deciding whether to trust you, and lifted her chin. And I saw, in the loose black fur of her throat, 4 small silver scars. The exact size and shape a splint of green wood might leave, cinched too tight by a frightened, grieving man 40 years before. I stopped doing the arithmetic after that. Some things you're better off not being able to explain. I closed the notebook and I put it away, and I made myself a promise, sitting there in the cold with the stove gone to embers, that whatever the cat was and however long she'd walked the earth, I would not let her friend die alone or afraid. It seemed the least a man could do. It seemed, that morning, like the only thing worth doing at all. I did not yet know that keeping that promise would break something in me. I did not know that within 2 weeks the whole town of Calder's Fork, every last stubborn, God-fearing, panther-shooting one of them, would stand in the snow outside that cabin with their hats in their hands and their faces wet, and that the thing that would bring them there was not the death of an old cowboy at all. It was what the shadow did at the very end. But that comes later. That's the part I still can't tell without stopping. For now, let me leave you here, in the gray cold of that first morning, with the stove gone out, and the old man sleeping easy for the first time in weeks, and the impossible cat lying warm along the length of him, keeping a watch that no medicine and no doctor and no prayer of mine had been able to keep. He was not alone. That was the whole of it. At the end of a long, hard life in which he had lost nearly everyone, Silas Wren was not going to have to go alone. And something with gold eyes and silver scars had walked out of 40 years of winters to make sure of it. His name was Emmett Doyle, and he was 11 years old, and he delivered the milk. And on the morning of the 10th of November, he came up the track to Silas's cabin the way he did twice a week, swinging his tin pail and kicking stones, and he looked in through the window, because boys look in through windows, and he saw the panther asleep on the bed with her paw across the old man's chest. He did not scream. I'll give him that much. He was a Doyle, and the Doyles didn't scream easy. He set the milk down on the porch step, quiet as he could, and he backed away, and then he ran the whole 2 miles back to town with his heart going like a rabbit's. And by noon, there was not a soul in Calder's Fork who had not heard that a mountain devil had gotten into old Wren's cabin and was eating him alive while he slept. That was the version that reached me. I'd gone down to the mercantile for laudanum, the only thing left that eased Silas's breathing, and I walked into a store full of men loading rifles. There were 6 of them, maybe 7. Hard men, most of them ranchers and the sons of ranchers, men who had lost calves and colts and once, years back, a child, to the cats that came down out of the high country in a bad winter. To them a panther was not a wonder. It was a debt owed in blood, and here was a chance to collect it. Cole Marsh was at the head of them, a big red-faced man who ran the biggest spread in the valley and had buried a nephew under a cougar's claws 20 years before, and he was checking the load on a Winchester with hands that shook a little. And when he saw me coming, he said, "Wick, good. You'll show us the way up. We'll have the thing dead before dark." And I stood in the doorway of that mercantile with the whole armed lot of them looking at me. And I understood that Whatever I said next was going to matter more than anything I'd ever said in my life. I could have told them the simple truth, that the cat was tame, that she'd been coming to Sela's for 40 years, that she'd done no harm and meant none. But I knew these men. I knew that tame was a word that would only make them more afraid, because a wild thing that isn't afraid of a man is more frightening to some men than one that is. And I knew that 40 years would get me laughed at, or worse, get Sela's laughed at, and I would not have that. Not now. Not at the end. So I lied, or I told a smaller truth, which is sometimes the only kind that fits through a door. She's already gone, I said. Came in out of the cold, slept the night, gone by morning. There's nothing up there but an old man dying, and he'd take it hard to have a pack of you come stamping in with guns while he does it. Let him be, Cole, for God's sake. Let the man be. It nearly worked. I saw it in their faces, that flicker of shame that even hard men feel when reminded that a neighbor is dying. Rifles lowered an inch. And then young Emmett Doyle, standing by the flour barrels where he'd been telling the story for the 5th time, piped up in that clear boy's voice. She weren't gone this mornin'. I seen her not 2 hours back. She had her paw right on his chest, Mr. Wick, right over his heart. And the rifles came back up. I want to tell you I stopped them with some grand and stirring speech. I didn't. What I did was smaller and stranger, and I've never been sure it was even mine to do. I said, then come and see. That's all. Come and see. I said it because I was out of lies and out of arguments, and because some part of me, the part that had sat up all night watching a wild thing hold a dying man like a mother holds a child, some part of me had decided that these men should not be allowed to go through their whole lives never having seen what I had seen. That it would be a kind of theft to keep it from them. That maybe, just maybe, if they saw it, the seeing would do to them what it had done to me. It was a fool's gamble. If I was wrong, I was leading 7 armed and frightened men straight to the thing I most wanted to protect. But I was tired, and I was grieving before the grief had even properly begun, and I could not think of anything else to do. So I turned and walked out of the mercantile and up the track toward the cabin, and behind me, after a long moment, I heard boots on the boards. All of them. Following. We came up the last rise as the light was going gold in the afternoon, and I held up my hand and made them stop at the fence line, and I went ahead alone to the window and looked in. She was there. Sombra was there, awake now, sitting up on her haunches beside the bed with her great head turned toward the glass. She'd heard us long before, of course she had, and her gold eyes found mine through the window, and I felt the whole weight of what I was about to do settle onto me. If she bolted, if she panicked, if she did the one wild thing they all expected of her, these men would kill her, and they would call it justice, and Silas would die knowing his oldest friend had been shot in his own dooryard. I opened the door. I stepped inside slow, my hands where she could see them. "It's all right, girl," I said the way Silas said it. "It's all right. Some folks are coming to say hello. You be easy now, you be easy." And then I did the thing that still makes my hands cold to remember. I went to the door, and I opened it wide, and I stood aside, and I let 7 men with rifles look into that room. Nobody fired. I've thought about why for 40 years of my own now, and the closest I can come is this. They had come up that hill braced to see a monster, and what they saw instead undid them faster than any argument could have. They saw a black panther the size of a small pony, yes, but they saw her sitting perfectly still beside the bed of a dying old man, and they saw that old man's hand resting in the fur of her back, and they saw her turn her head and look at them not with a hunter's flat hunger, but with something that in any human face they'd have called wariness and worry, and a plain and simple asking to be left in peace. And into the silence, Silas Wren opened his eyes. He couldn't see them well by then, his sight had been going for weeks, but he could hear the shuffle of them in his doorway, and he knew the sound of frightened men. And he did something that I think saved her life. He laughed, that same dry cough of a laugh, and he said in a voice that barely carried but carried far enough, "Cole Marsh, that you breathing like a bull in my doorway? Come to shoot my cat, have you?" Cole Marsh stood in that door with his rifle half raised and his big red face working, and he could not find a single word. "She's called Sombra," Silas went on, each word an effort, his hand never leaving her fur. "She's older than your grandchildren and gentler than your dogs, and she's come to my door every winter of my life since before you were born. She pulled me back from the edge of a thing worse than dying once, a long time ago, and she's never asked me for one thing in return but a warm floor and the sight of my ugly face. And now she's come to see me out. So you can shoot her, Cole. You surely can. But you'll do it in front of me, and you'll do it knowing you shot the best friend I ever had, off the deathbed of a man who never did you a wrong in his life. Now." The old man drew a long, wet, rattling breath. "Is that the man you want to be, on this particular afternoon? I have seen a lot of things break in my life. Horses, fences, promises, men. I never saw anything break the way Cole Marsh broke in that doorway. The rifle came down. It came down slow, like it weighed more than he could hold, and his big shoulders came down with it, and this enormous hard man who had buried a nephew and hated the high country cats for 20 years put his hand over his own face and stood there in a dying man's doorway and wept without any sound at all. 'No, Silas,' he said when he could. 'No, that ain't the man I want to be.' And he took off his hat. They came in then, one at a time, hats in their hands, quiet as men come into a church. And Sombra, who could have scattered them like leaves, only drew herself up a little closer to Silas and watched them come and let them. That was the thing none of us could get over in the days that followed. She let them. Men she'd never seen, men who smelled of gun, oil, and fear, and the sweat of the climb, filed past within arm's reach of her one and two at a time to pay their respects to a dying man, and she never once bared a tooth. It was as if she understood, and I have stopped saying as if, honestly, because I no longer believe she didn't understand that these were his people, and that her being there was frightening them, and that she would suffer it for him, because he had asked her to be easy. She had spent 40 years learning to trust one man, and on his say-so at the very end, she extended a little sliver of that trust to the whole sorry, frightened rest of us. Old Cole Marsh knelt down by the bed. This man who'd come to kill got down on his knees on the plank floor and took Silas's free hand in both of his and said, "What do you need, Silas? Tell me what you need and it's done." And Silas, whose whole life had been a lesson in needing nothing and asking for less, said the only thing he wanted. "Don't let them hunt her," he whispered. When I'm gone and she goes back up the mountain, don't let your boys or anybody's boys go up there after her for a trophy. She's got a few winters left in her and I want her to have them. Give me your word, Cole, in front of Wick. Give me your word." "You've got it," Cole said. "Before God and Thomas Wick, you've got it. No man in this valley raises a hand to that cat while I've got breath to stop him." And then, because Cole Marsh was many things but never a man to do a thing halfway, he added, "And I'll put it about every ranch, every hand, every fool boy with a gun. The black cat's under the protection of Calder's Fork, and any man who touches her answers to me." He said it loud, so the men behind him would hear, and they murmured their assent, and I saw Silas's face at that, and I will carry the look on it to my own grave. Relief, pure relief. The last worldly worry of a dying man lifted off him by the very men who'd climbed the hill to make it worse. He had one friend left in the world that he could not protect past his own death, and he had just watched a room full of former enemies swear to do it for him. Word went down the mountain that evening the way fire goes through dry grass, but it was a different word than the one that had come up. Emmett Doyle, who'd started the whole business, was made to carry the new version to every door, as a kind of penance and a kind of honor both, and I've always thought it did the boy good. By the next morning there was not a soul in Calder's Fork who didn't know that old Silas Wren was dying with a wild panther keeping watch over him, and that the panther was not to be touched, and that Cole Marsh himself had wept in the man's doorway and taken off his hat. And here is the thing about a small town that outsiders never understand. They think small towns are cruel, narrow, and hard and quick to judge, and sometimes they are. But a small town is also the only place left where a thing like this can happen, because in a small town everybody's grief is everybody's business and everybody's wonder is too. By noon the next day they started coming up the hill, not to gawk, to bring things. That's what they did with their fear and their awe and their sudden strange tenderness. They turned it into casseroles and firewood and clean linen and jars of preserves, the whole homely vocabulary of care that country people reach for when there's nothing else to reach for. Mrs. Abernathy, who'd not spoken to Silas in a decade over some feud so old nobody remembered it, came up with a pot of chicken and dumplings and left it on the step, and stood a long while at the fence with her apron pressed to her mouth, watching the window. The Ferris brothers brought a cord of split wood and stacked it against the cabin wall without being asked. The schoolteacher, Miss Colvin, brought a book of Psalms and asked, shy and serious, whether she might read to him, and I said yes, and she sat in the doorway. She could not quite bring herself to come all the way in, with the cat there, and she read in a low, sweet voice while Sombra watched her with those gold eyes and Silas drifted in and out, and it was one of the most peaceful hours of that whole long week. They left offerings for the cat, too. That's the part that gets me still. These ranchers who'd spent their lives at war with the high country predators started leaving cuts of meat wrapped in cloth at the edge of the yard, good meat, the kind they'd not have wasted on a barn cat, as though the shadow were a thing to be honored, a guest, a saint of some rough desert religion nobody had a name for. Sombra never touched a scrap of it while people were watching, but it was always gone by morning. Silas was fatting faster now. The peace the cat brought him seemed to let him stop fighting, and a man who stops fighting death goes quicker, though gentler too, and I could not decide whether to be grateful or afraid of that. He slept most of the time. When he woke he was often somewhere else back in the Box Canyon, 40 years gone, talking to Ada, talking to a cub that wasn't there, or that was there, depending on how you counted. Sombra never left him. She ate a little of what the town left, when the dark came and no one watched, and she drank from the basin I set down for her, and the rest of the time she lay along the length of the old man like a second, blacker shadow, and she kept her watch. And I kept mine. I'd stopped pretending I had anywhere else to be. Cole Marsh sent word down that my chores at the other ranches were covered, that half the valley had volunteered to see to my work so I could stay, and I stayed. I wrote in my notebook. I read Miss Colvin's Psalms when she wasn't there too. I talked to the cat. I'd started talking to the cat, the way you talk to a person, because it had stopped feeling foolish and started feeling only right. And I fed the stove, and I waited, the three of us together, for the thing that was coming. On the evening of the 16th, Silas surfaced one last time all the way to himself. His eyes cleared. He looked at me across the room and he knew me, knew exactly where and when he was, and he said, "Wick, come here a minute. I want to tell you something before I can't." I went and knelt by the bed the way Cole had. Sombra shifted to make room for me, which undid me a little all on its own. And Silas took my hand in his cold, papery one, and he said the last clear thing he ever said to me, and I'm going to give it to you exactly, because I've never forgotten a word of it, and because I think it's the truest thing anybody ever told me about how to live. "I spent a lot of years," he said, "thinking the great mistake of my life was that I never had a child to leave things to, all that love and no place to put it. And then one day I opened a trap a scared little cat was dying in, and I've spent 40 years learning that love don't much care where you meant to put it. It goes where it goes. It grows what it grows. That cat is the best thing I ever made, and I didn't make her at all, I just didn't shoot her one bad day, and I stayed a little longer than made sense. That's the whole secret, Wick. Don't shoot the thing you could love. Stay a little longer than makes sense. Everything good I ever got, I got from staying a little longer than made sense." He closed his eyes then. His hand loosened in mine, and I thought that was the end of it, and I was wrong. He had one night left in him yet, but I never heard him speak plainly again after that. Whatever else he had to say, he said it to the shadow in the dark, in a language I wasn't meant to understand. I stepped outside as the stars came out to breathe, and to let them have their last privacy, the man and the cat. The night was hard and clear and cold, the kind of cold Sela's always said she hated, and down the mountain I could see the lights of Calder's Fork, every window lit, and I don't know how I knew, but I knew that half the town was sitting up that night the way I was, waiting, keeping a vigil for an old cowboy most of them had barely known a week before, and for the impossible black creature that had come out of the dark to love him better than his own kind ever had. A whole town, learning in the space of a week how to be tender about a thing they didn't understand, learning to leave meat for a monster, learning to take off their hats. I did not yet know what the morning would bring. I did not know that the shadow had one last thing to do, a thing that would bring every one of those lit windows up the mountain and into the snow, and that would leave the hardest men in that valley crying openly in the cold. I only stood there in the dark on the 16th of November and watched the town's lights burn and felt the terrible tender weight of being one of the few who got to see the whole of it. Behind me, through the thin wall of the cabin, I could hear the old man's breathing, slower now, and the low chesty rumble of the cat, that sound like a purr with grief folded into it, going on in the dark like a lullaby sung backward, from the child to the father, from the saved to the one who'd stayed a little longer than made sense. Sela's wren died at dawn on the 17th of November, and he did not die alone, and he did not die afraid, and I have spent 40 years being grateful for both of those things, and I will spend whatever I've got left being grateful still. I was in the room. I'd come back in near midnight, unable to bear the cold or the waiting any longer, and I'd taken up my chair by the stove, and at some point in the small hours I'd slept despite myself. What woke me was the quiet. The breathing had changed. You learn the sound of it if you sit with enough dying, that long slow spacing out of the breath as the body starts to set down its burden, and I sat up, and the gray of dawn was just coming to the window, and I saw them. Sombra had moved in the night. She lay stretched full along the old man now, her body pressed the length of his, her great black head tucked into the curve of his neck and shoulder, exactly the place a wife might lay her head, or a child. And Sela's had one arm around her loose, the way you hold something in your sleep that you love and don't want to lose. His face was turned toward her. His eyes were half open, and they were not seeing me or the room or the coming light. They were seeing something else, something further off, and I like to think better. He took 3 more breaths while I watched, long ones with a great deal of silence between. And on the third, at the exact moment the first hard line of sun came over the ridge and struck the window and filled that little cabin with cold gold light, on that third breath, he let go and did not draw another. And Sombra lifted her head and she looked at his face, and she knew. Whatever else you want to believe or not believe, you'll not take this from me. She knew. She looked at the stillness where the breathing had been, and she put her nose to his cheek, and she made a sound I had never heard and have thanked God I've never heard again. It was not a roar I could have borne. It was low, and it climbed, and it broke, a long rising cry that started in her chest and came out through that great throat and filled the cabin and rolled out the open window and down the whole cold mountain, a sound with a shape to it. A sound that any creature that has ever loved and lost would know in its bones for exactly what it was. It was mourning, naked and total, and beyond anything the human throat is built to make. Down in Calder's Fork they heard it. Every soul that had sat up that night, and most that hadn't, heard that cry come down the mountain in the first light, and to a person they knew what it meant. Sela's was gone, and the thing that loved him was grieving. They came up the mountain then, all of them. I didn't see them coming. I was on my knees by the bed, useless, wrecked, saying goodbye to the best man I ever knew, but I heard them after a while. The crunch of many feet in the frost. And when I finally got up and went to the door, the sun full up now and the world all hard blue shadow and blinding white, I saw the whole town of Calder's Fork coming up the track. Cole Marsh at the front, hatless, his breath smoking. The Ferris brothers. Mrs. Abernathy with a shawl over her nightdress. Miss Colvin, the Doyles, and young Emmett white-faced among them. The doctor who'd stopped being able to help. Storekeepers and ranch hands and children carried on shoulders. 100 people, more, the whole living body of that town, come up the mountain in the cold because a cat had told them, in a language older than language, that it was time. And they stopped at the fence, the way they'd stopped before, because the cabin door was open and they could see inside, and inside was the shadow. Sombra had not left him. She lay along the dead man still, her head on his chest, and she was not crying now. That one great cry had been the whole of it, and she'd gone quiet, a terrible dignified quiet, and she watched the town gather at the fence with those gold eyes, and nobody moved, and nobody spoke, and nobody, I think, breathed. For a long moment the whole of us stood frozen in the cold gold morning, the living at the fence, and the dead in the bed, and the grieving shadow between, and it was the most silent 100 people I have ever stood among. Then Sombra rose. She rose off the bed slow and stiff. She was old, I remembered then, however impossibly old, and she moved like an old thing that morning, all the ease gone out of her, and she stood on the floor beside him and lowered her head once more to his still face, and held it there a long moment, and then she turned, and she walked to the open door. The crowd at the fence pulled back with a single indrawn breath, 100 people flinching as one. Cole Marsh threw out both arms to hold them still, to keep some fool from bolting or, God forbid, from reaching for a gun, and he needn't have. Nobody moved, because Sombra was not charging. She came out of that cabin into the sunlight, the first time most of them had ever seen her whole, in daylight, the full impossible black glory of her, and she stood on the porch in front of all of them and she looked at them. She looked at the town. She turned her great head slow along the whole line of them from one end to the other, gold eyes moving over face after face after face, and I swear before anything you like to swear before that she was reading them, taking them in, marking somehow the people who had come. And then she did the thing. She walked down off the porch, straight toward the crowd, and the crowd held by Cole's arms and by Silas's word and by something none of them could have named, and she walked up to Cole Marsh himself, the man who had climbed the mountain to kill her a week before, and she stopped in front of him, close enough to touch. And this enormous predator, this shadow out of 40 years of winters, lowered her head to the big red-faced rancher, slow, deliberate, unmistakable. She bowed to him. And she pressed her forehead, once gentle, against his chest, the same place she'd pressed it against Silas's throat, over the heart, and she held it there a moment, and Cole Marsh stood rooted with the tears running openly down into his collar and did not move a muscle, did not so much as breathe, and let her. It was thanks. I have never been able to make it be anything else, though I've tried for the comfort of it to make it be less. It was thanks. She was thanking him for the word he'd given, for the promise that she'd have her few winters left, for the hats that came off and the meat left at the yard's edge, and the town that had learned in a week to be tender about a thing it didn't understand. She could not have known the words of the promise. But she knew, the way she'd always known everything about us that mattered, what these people had chosen to be. And she came down off that porch to say, in the only way she had, that she had seen it, and that it counted. Then she lifted her head and she stepped back, and she looked one last time at the open door of the cabin where her friend of 40 years lay still in the cold gold light. And she turned, and she went up the mountain, black against the snow, unhurried, without once looking back, up and up until she was only a moving darkness on the white, and then a speck, and then the ridge took her and she was gone. That was when the town wept. Not before they'd been too frozen with awe and fear to feel much of anything. But when the shadow crested the ridge and vanished, when the thing was over and the mountain was just a mountain again and the only sound was the wind, it came down on all of them at once, the whole enormous weight of what they'd witnessed, and 100 people stood in the snow outside a dead man's cabin and cried like children. Hard men who hadn't wept since they were boys, old women, the Ferris brothers holding each other up. Cole Marsh, with his forehead still marked, he swore for the rest of his life, with the cold print of where she'd touched him, sitting down right there in the frost and putting his face in his hands. Emmett Doyle, who'd started all of it, sobbing into his mother's shawl. And me in the doorway, past crying, hollowed out, watching a whole town break open over an old cowboy and his shadow. I've thought a great deal in the years since about why. Why it hit them all so hard, people who'd barely known Silas, who'd have shot the cat on sight a week before. And the closest I can come is this. They were not weeping only for Silas and not only for the cat. They were weeping for the thing itself, for the plain, unbearable fact of it, that a love like that was possible in the world had been walking their mountain the whole time, and they'd nearly killed it out of fear. They were weeping the way you weep when something shows you that the world is larger and stranger and more full of tenderness than you'd let yourself believe, and that you almost missed it, and that you'll never be able to unsee it now. They were weeping because they'd been changed, all at once, against their will, and there is no grief quite like the grief of being made better too late to tell the one who did it. We buried Silas Wren 3 days later on the 20th of November in the little cemetery on the south slope where you can see the high country. The whole town came. Cole Marsh paid for a stone out of his own pocket, a good one, granite, and he had them cut something on it that wasn't Silas's dates or a verse of scripture, and when I asked him why, he wouldn't quite meet my eye. The stone said under the name and the years 3 words, SDAYED, a little longer. That was all. Cole had heard me repeat what Silas told me that last clear night. I'd said it at the grave, not meaning to. It had just come out of me, and he'd had it cut into the rock. And to this day, if you go up to that cemetery, you can read it. Worn now but still there, and nobody who reads it understands it, and that's all right. It wasn't cut for them. They kept the promise too. That's the last thing I'll tell you, and then I'll let this rest and let myself rest with it. For the rest of Cole Marsh's life and past it, no man in that valley raised a hand to the black cat. The word got handed down like an heirloom, ranch to ranch, father to son, the shadows under the protection of Calder's Fork, long after anyone living had seen her, long after any panther could conceivably still have drawn breath. Boys grew up knowing you did not hunt the high country for a black cat, and not quite knowing why, only that it was a thing their fathers were solemn about, and that was enough. And every winter for years after, I know this because I stayed on, I never did leave that ranch. Every winter, when the first hard cold came down off the ridge, somebody would find that a cut of meat had been left at the edge of the old cabin's yard, wrapped in cloth in the dark, by no hand anybody ever admitted to. And it would be gone by morning. I could never catch who did it. I don't think it was any one person. I think it was the town, keeping a vigil it couldn't have explained, feeding a shadow that was almost certainly long gone, because to stop would have been to admit the whole thing was over, and none of them could bear to be the one to admit it. I am the last one now, the last who was in the room. Cole Marsh has been 40 years in the ground beside Silas. I helped carry him. Emmett Doyle grew up and grew old and died a grandfather, and he told the story his whole life badly, the way they all did, and I never once corrected him because the wrong version was the one that let people sleep. Miss Colvin married and moved away. The town is smaller now, and the young ones don't leave meat at the yard's edge anymore, and the cabin's fallen in, and if you didn't know to look, you'd never find the stone that says SDAYED a little longer on the south slope with a view of the high country. But I know to look, and when the first hard cold comes down off the ridge each November, that first cold that means the years turning to bone, the cold Silas always said she hated, I still go up to that yard. I'm too old to do much now. I just stand where the porch used to be and I look up at the ridge line going dark, and I leave a little meat wrapped in cloth at the edge of the old yard, and I say her name into the cold. Sombra, shadow, and I don't stay to see whether it's gone by morning. I've stopped needing to know. Some things you're better off not being able to explain. I only know what I saw. I saw a scared man open a trap instead of firing a gun, and stay a little longer than made sense, and I saw 40 years of winters come of it. I saw a wild thing love an old cowboy so completely that when he died it came down out of the dark and thanked the very men who meant to kill it for letting it love him a little longer. I saw a whole town learn in a single week how to take off its hat and weep in the snow, and keep a promise to a shadow for 100 years. And I have come to believe that this is most of what any of us are here to do, to not shoot the thing we could love, to stay a little longer than makes sense, to leave a little meat at the edge of the yard for something that's probably already gone, on the chance, the small, cold, holy chance, that it isn't, and that it's out there still, up in the high country where the cold comes from, watching the lights of the town it once forgave, and remembering the one door that always opened, and the hand that always reached into the dark to let the shadow in.